knowing the world. I took a good deal of pains with his education, sir. Let him run the streets when he was very young and shift for hisself. It's the only way to make a boy sharp, sir. One of the problems with standard leadership courses is that they focus exclusively on skills and produce managers rather than leaders when they produce anything at all. Managerial skills can, of course, be taught, and they are useful skills for leaders to have. The ingredients of leadership cannot be taught, however. They must be learned. As then Cafcio, Robert Dockson put it, the things that matter can't be taught. In a formal classroom setting, Walter Wriston at Citicorp and A.P. Giannini at the Bank of America weren't technicians. They were men of vision. They knew what they wanted to do and where they wanted to take their companies. Since by definition, leaders are unique, what they learn and how they use it to shape the future is unique, too. As I noted in the last chapter, leaders are made at least as much by their experiences and their understanding and application of their experiences as by any skills. Norman Lear told me of an experience he had when he was in the Air Force stationed in Italy. I remember decking one guy I hit one guy in my life before anybody hit me in a bar in Foggia, Italy. He was a GI making an anti-Semitic joke, and I wrote an episode of All in the Family about it. Mike hit somebody who was violating somebody else on the subway and scared himself with his own violence, and I had scared myself that way. I guess I see leadership in that, but I don't know where that comes from except that early feeling of how do I overcome this problem of being so much a minority and so unwanted. Clearly, to become a true leader, one must know the world as well as one knows oneself. A variety of studies, as well as the lives of the leaders I talked with, demonstrates that certain kinds of experiences are especially significant for learning. These experiences include broad and continuing education, idiosyncratic families, extensive travel and or exile, a rich private life, and key associations with mentors and groups. I want to discuss the benefits of those experiences, but first I want to get into some ideas about learning itself. In 1972, the Club of Rome began a groundbreaking study of learning, opening with a delineation of outer limits, which, in its words, narrow our possibilities of material growth on a finite planet, and closing with a defense of the inner free margins, which exist in ourselves and are pregnant with the potency of unparalleled developments. Still relevant today, the club's report was published in 1979 as No Limits to Learning, Bridging the Human Gap by James W. Bach and Matteo Mandra and Mircea Milica. Aurelio Pecchii states in his foreword, all we need at this point in human evolution is to learn what it takes to learn what we should learn, and learn it. The authors go on to define the human gap as the distance between growing complexity and our capacity to cope with it. We call it human gap because it is a dichotomy between a growing complexity of our own making and a lagging development of our own capacities. The authors describe the two principal modes of conventional learning. Maintenance learning, the most prevalent, is the acquisition of fixed outlooks, methods and rules for dealing with known and recurring situations. It is the type of learning designed to maintain an existing system or established way of life. Shock learning, almost as prevalent now, occurs when Events overwhelm people. As the authors put it, even up to the present moment, humanity continues to wait for events and crises that catalyze or impose as primitive. Learning by shock. Shock learning can be seen as a product of elitism, technocracy, and authoritarianism. Learning by shock often follows a period of overconfidence in solutions created solely with expert knowledge or technical competence and perpetuated beyond the conditions for which they were appropriate. In other words, both maintenance learning and shock learning are less learning than they are accepting conventional wisdom. Society or one's family or school says this is the way things are, and these are the things you need to know, and you accept what you're told as gospel. You forget that there is a self. That must be listened to. America's automotive industry prospered on maintenance, learning, until it suddenly found itself up against the wall, outdone, and outsold by the Japanese automotive wizards, and learned by shock that it was in crisis. Detroit was bankrupt creatively and facing financial ruin, but instead of trying to think its way out of the dilemma, it ran on shock for years, closing down plants, throwing thousands of employees out of work, buying any solution that looked good. It wasn't until recently that Detroit truly began to examine and recover from its self-inflicted wounds, evidence of what the Club of Rome calls innovative learning that may come too late. The authors write, the conventional pattern of maintenance/shock learning is inadequate to cope with global complexity and is likely, if unchecked, to lead to loss of control over events and crises. What applies on a global basis applies on the personal level. 2. Anyone who relies on maintenance and shock learning is bound to be more reactive than actor in his or her own life. For example, most families simply maintain when someone in the family dies suddenly, the shock is so profound that the family frequently falls apart, at least temporarily. We all know husbands and wives who were so devastated by the death of a child that they wound up divorced. In the same way, people in business who simply accept conventional wisdom may reach the top of a bureaucratic organization, but they will never use their particular talents to their fullest. And if they ever confront their own lives, they will suffer the shock of failed aspirations at the very least. So innovative learning must replace maintenance/shock learning. The principal components of innovative learning are anticipation, being active and imaginative rather than passive and habitual, learning by listening to others, participation, shaping events rather than being shaped by them. Obviously, then innovative learning requires that you trust yourself, that you be self-directed rather than other-directed in both your life and your work. If you learn to anticipate the future and shape events rather than being shaped by them, you will benefit in significant ways. In making what the authors of the Club of Rome report call the shift from unconscious adaptation to conscious participation, we make or recognize new connections, generating useful syntheses, and our understanding deepens. Movie director Pollock discussed the forces that work against innovative learning. Everybody has the ability to free associate, but society tends to frown on active fantasies. Beyond a certain age, we stop playing games. Let's pretend, what if, and all that, it goes on in your head anyway. But at some point you start to feel guilty. You listen to a symphony and imagine that you're the conductor. And there you are, conducting like crazy, but then you get to be a grown man and you say, gee, I'd hate for anybody to know that I'm pretending I'm conducting the symphony. But that kind of fantasy life is the real key to problem solving at every level. It's certainly the primary tool for problem solving in art, whether it's painting or dancing or choreography, or directing films or writing scripts or writing novels, or whatever. Creative problem solving is a form of innovative learning. In innovative learning, one must not only recognize existing contexts, but be capable of imagining future contexts. American foreign policy was skewed for generations because our policy makers operated on the false assumption that communism was monolithic. It was a textbook example of maintenance learning. In fact, even during the Soviet era, there were many varieties of communism. Maintenance learning sees communism as purely political rather than social, economic, and political. Innovative learning sees through the political similarities to the social and economic differences that make the few remaining communist societies distinct. Innovative learning is a way of realizing vision. Attorney Shirley Hustadler spoke about looking ahead. You have to be able to envision in fairly concrete terms what ought to be done, or what you want to do, or where you want to go. A certain amount of conceptualization is required. It's not unlike planning a trip. First, you have to figure out where you want to go. Then you have to devise a mode of transportation. If no one's done it before, you may have to make it up. You have to maintain a certain amount of flexibility in organizing people to go with you. You have to know from the beginning how much baggage you have to haul or how light you can travel. It requires a combination of historical perspective, vision, and institutional appreciation. What its texture is, what its possibilities are. Maintenance learning, which most organizations and educational institutions practice, seeks to preserve the status quo and make good soldiers of us all. It's a monologue based on authority, hierarchical, exclusive, and isolating, being limited and finite. It is a static body of knowledge. It requires us to adjust to things as they are. Shock learning keeps us in line and obedient by confirming our inability to control events or prepare for the future as individuals, and by affirming the need for authority and hierarchical organizations to protect us. Innovative learning is the primary means of exercising our autonomy, a means of understanding and working within the prevailing context in a positive way. It is a dialogue that begins with curiosity and is fueled by knowledge, leading to understanding. It is inclusive, unlimited, and unending knowing and dynamic. It allows us to change the way things are. In sum, we have the means within us to free ourselves from the constraints of the past, which lock us into imposed roles and attitudes. By examining and understanding the past, we can move into the future unencumbered by it. We become free to express ourselves rather than endlessly trying to prove ourselves. In the same way, through the exercise of innovative learning, we no longer follow along, but rather lead our own lives. We do not accept things as they are, but rather anticipate things as they can be. We participate in making things happen. We shape life rather than being shaped by it. This dictum is borne out again and again. In the early 1960s, Victor and Mildred Gortzel set out to discover what several hundred successful men and women had in common and publish their findings in Cradles of Eminence. Their subjects range from writers and actors to politicians and businessmen. Their findings are instructive. Most of their subjects came from small towns or villages. In almost every household, there was a love of learning, often accompanied by a physical exuberance and a persistent drive toward goals. Half of the parents were opinionated about controversial subjects. Nearly half the fathers were subject to traumatic vicissitudes in their business or professional careers, while 1/4 of the mothers were described as dominating. Wealth was much more frequent than abject poverty. 1/4 of the subjects were physically handicapped. The homes of the subjects were exceptionally free of mental illnesses, requiring hospitalization. As children, the subjects enjoyed being tutored, most frequently disliked secondary school, and most frequently liked the prestige college, a full 3/4. Expressed dissatisfaction with schools and school teachers, although 4/5 showed exceptional talent. Finally, 3/4 of the subjects were troubled as children by poverty, a broken home, difficult parents, financial UPS and Down's physical handicaps, or parental dissatisfaction over their children's school failures or vocational choices. The Gortzels include a statement from T. H. Huxley that sums up the need to examine and overcome one's past that I outlined earlier. Huxley said, "Sit down before fact is a little. Child, be prepared to give up every preconceived notion. Follow humbly wherever and to whatever abyss nature leads, or you shall learn nothing. There is nothing you can do about your early life now, except to understand it. You can, however, do everything about the rest of your life. As John Gardner once said, the maturing of any complex talent requires a happy combination of motivation, character, and opportunity. Most talent remains undeveloped. Universities, unfortunately, are not always the best place to learn. Too many of them are less places of higher learning than. They are high-class vocational schools. Too many produce narrow-minded specialists who may be wizards at making money, but who are unfinished as people. These specialists have been taught how to do, but they have not learned how to be. Instead of studying philosophy, history, and literature, which are the experiences of all humankind, they study specific technologies. In the long run, narrow specialties may be more prone to obsolescence and may fail to deliver big salaries, let alone the incalculable rewards of a more broadly examined life. Educator and former Disney executive Marty Kaplan said, "You spend your early years asking your parents all the big questions. Where am I from? Why did Grandpa die and where? Did he go and who is God? Kids are sponges for that stuff. What do undergraduates talk about in the middle of the night? But that stuff? What am I doing with my life? Who am I? All." Those questions that we encourage in a liberal arts confrontation with the abyss, I think that's at the core of our notion of what Western values are the confrontation with the abyss, and some people will call the abyss death in a sort of casual biological sense, while some people have a much more metaphysical conception of nothingness. But I think it starts in the child, and we either let it flourish or repress it, but it's always there, and it's always going to be there. Poet Richard Wilbur wrote, "But ceremony never did conceal, save to the silly eye, which all allows / how much we are, the woods we wander in." We need to wander through all the woods at our disposal, and out of all that to begin to understand ourselves, and the world. In the mid-1980s, the issue of our cultural illiteracy reached the bestseller lists with Alan Bloom's The Closing of the American Mind and E.D. Hirsch Jr.'s Cultural Literacy, What Every American Needs to Know, a nationwide test of history and literature. Given to 7,800 high school juniors, proved Bloom and Hirsch's thesis. The average score, as reported in What Do Our 17-Year-Olds Know? By Diane Ravitch and Chester E. Finn Jr., was in the 50s and F. The authors wrote, perhaps the most obvious indicator of how process-driven our schools have become is the dominant role played by the Scholastic Aptitude Test. Looming over our educational landscape is an examination that, in its verbal component, carefully avoids assessing substantive knowledge. Whether test takers have studied the Civil War, learned about the Magna Carta, or read Macbeth are matters to which the SAT is studiously indifferent. Whatever our schools are teaching, or at least testing, has increasingly less to do with what we have historically considered education, and more to do with the ubiquitous bottom line. A study by the Carnegie Foundation shows that an increasing number of young people choose fields that promise to be instantly profitable, such as business, engineering, computer science, and health programs.
Yet Lynn Cheney, former chairman of the National Endowment for the Humanities and wife of former Vice President Dick Cheney, wrote in Newsweek that many of the country's most successful people had a liberal arts background, including President Reagan and a majority of his cabinet, 38% of all CEOs, and 9 of the top 13 executives at IBM. According to Cheney, an AT&T study showed that social science and humanities graduates move faster into middle management than engineers, and were doing at least as well as their business and engineering counterparts in reaching top management levels. She concludes, students who follow their hearts in choosing majors will most likely end up laboring at what they love. They're the ones who will put in the long hours and intense effort that achievement requires. And they're the ones who will find the sense of purpose that underlies most human happiness. Roger Smith, former chairman and CEO of General Motors, agrees. Smith wrote in the book Educating Managers, "The art of management begins with vision, a quality that has never been so crucial as it is today. Competitiveness and, for some companies, survival itself depends on the manager's ability to envision new things as well as new ways of doing old things, to extrapolate on the basis of what worked in the past, to organize and reorganize operations, and to imagine how and by what kind of intervention the course of events might be changed. When students are trained to recognize recurring elements and common themes in art, literature, physics, and history, they are learning about the kind of creativity that leads to visionary solutions to business problems. People trained in the liberal arts would be able to understand, function in, and contribute to the loose, tight entrepreneurial organization that so many other businesses are striving to become. They learn to tolerate ambiguity and to bring order out of apparent confusion. Intellectual integrity is paramount, and reasoning processes are just as important as the conclusions to which they lead. They have the kind of sideways thinking and cross-classifying habit of mind that comes from learning, among other things, the many different ways of looking at literary works, social systems, chemical processes, or languages. The attributes of excellence all depend on communication skills and sensitivity to people. Everything we do depends on the successful transfer of meaning from one group to another. CBS Inquirer also agrees. In 1984, the Corporate Council on the Liberal Arts, representing 12 major companies, was established with a $750,000 grant from CBS in association with the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. The council's purpose, according to its then chairman, Frank Stanton, a former CBS president, is to heighten awareness of a liberal arts education insight, perception, critical inquiry, and imagination, and to understand the relationship between liberal arts learning and leadership in the corporate world. That relationship is very real and very strong. This is not to suggest, however, that if you majored in business or computer science, you fouled up. One of the marvelous things about life is that any gaps in your education can be filled, whatever your age or situation, by reading and thinking about what you read. Filling in the gaps. Author Ray Bradbury, giving advice to managers on how to feed creativity, started his recipe with this. Well now, when was the last time you ran to a library and took home more books than you could read, like stacked loaves of bread, warm in your arms, waiting to be chewed? When for that matter was the last time you opened a book, placed it to your nose, and gave a great sniff? Heaven, the smell of bread, baking. When was the last time that you found a really great old bookstore and wandered through it hour after hour, alone, finding yourself on the shelves, with no list, no intellectual priorities, just wandering, snuffing the dust, plucking the pigeon books off the shelves to read their entrails, and not in love, putting them back, or in love, toting them home? To be lost in time is to find your roots. If you want a more formal approach, many colleges, universities, and community colleges offer classes in literature, philosophy, and history. Just to let you know that I sometimes practice what I preach. I once went to Cambridge with two of my children so that we could all take classes together. My choice was Charles Dickens and Victorian England. My daughter Kate studied Shakespeare and comedies, and my son Will took Darwin and modern science. We stayed on one floor of Trinity Hall at Trinity College and spent a marvelous 3 weeks immersed in our books, excitedly swapping the best of what we were learning. Now a professor of constitutional law at American University, Jamie Raskin was an assistant attorney general in Boston when he warned against letting your ambition get in the way of your intellectual growth. Ambition is the death of thought, as Wittgenstein said. A number of my friends are as ambitious as I am, but they suppress any thoughts that might be subversive or dangerous to their ambitions. Your intellectual life is really the ability to see how things can be different, and big institutions in society, whether public or private, often ask people to toe the line in any number of ways: personal, political, ideological. And clearly one can get ahead by doing that. I guess the only way to prevent ambition from killing your intellectual life is not to be afraid of losing, or to say something people might think is wrong or crazy, something the institution isn't ready to hear yet. If you want a concrete tip, learn how to speed read. People say they don't have time to read. My feeling is, when in doubt, read it. I can read a book in a couple of hours. Then CBS executive Barbara Corday said, regarding education, if I were talking to young executives, I'd advise them to forget their MBAs. A lot of young leaders are very taken with their own credentials, and they forget that most American leaders of the past 150 years didn't have MBAs, didn't have PhDs. I barely graduated from high school and have never had another day of formal education. I'm not saying that because I'm particularly proud of it, but I'm also not embarrassed about it. In my business, very few people have an academic background that matches in any way what they're doing now. A liberal arts education is probably the best thing for my business, and I feel I have that, even though I don't have a degree to show. A lot of the young people I've dealt with in the last 5 years have all sorts of degrees, but they lack some of the personality traits, the showmanship and enthusiasm and childlike qualities that the entertainment business requires, and it makes me sad to see that. People who go to plays, read books, know the classics, who have an open mind and enjoy experiences, are more apt to be successful in my business than someone with an MBA in finance. Charles Handy, one of Great Britain's thought leaders, would agree with her. He told me that the primary lesson he learned at the Sloan School of Management was that he didn't need to go to school. James E. Burke, former CEO of Johnson & Johnson, learned a lot while getting an MBA. However, I went to that school, Harvard Business School, with a set of values that I had gotten, as people suggest you should, from family and church and so forth. I was young, and I wasn't sure that I could succeed in business with my value system. I was really torn. I had somehow picked up, as many people do in this country, I don't know where, that there was something, not immoral, about business, but a sense that you had to play the edges in order to be successful. I think a lot of people feel that way. The business school was a tremendous release because everything I was taught at the business school said that's not true. The way to be successful is to be straight. The education of former Xerox executive Ren Zafiropoulos, who founded Versatech, a major producer of electrostatic printers, began at home. I was brought up in Egypt by Greek parents. My father was a sea captain, a pilot in the Suez Canal. He didn't have any collegiate degrees, but he'd been everywhere and was a heavy reader. He used to say, "Your house is your university." He was a poet. Instead of going to church, we all listened to classical music on Sundays. His advice to me was never to do anything because other people did it, but because it made good sense to me. I was a good student, not straight A's, but good. Straight A students never seem to get over it. I had a lot of other interests. I studied painting, composed music, did some woodworking, wrote poems. It's easy enough to learn marketing, selling, engineering, whatever. It's harder to learn how to optimize your own performance in that of your subordinates. It's vital to possess an adequate understanding of the first principles of human behavior in order to perform as optimum supervisors and directors of people. John Scully, like Jim Burke, believes in formal education and took an MBA. Scully's curriculum vitae is well known. He left PepsiCo after a very successful run when Apple co-founder Steve Jobs challenged him by asking whether he really wanted to spend the rest of his life selling sugar water or he wanted a chance to change the world. Scully was CEO of Apple when he told me he saw genuine and valuable links between education and business. The people I gravitate to are dreamers. I wouldn't live anywhere except near a great university because I like access to the libraries, to academics. Most new industries tend to grow up around major university communities, which means that potential leaders are developing in a very different context from the traditional narrow one. This isn't a high-tech phenomenon. The question isn't how many computer scientists use our computers, but how many artists use them. Don Ritchie summed it up thusly: education helps produce conceptual skills. The majority of people don't learn those skills without the help of some education. I don't know that the humanities are better than a business education, but I think a university helps you learn how to think and to analyze problems, to see things as a whole, and see how you can put them together. It seems to me that the people with an educational match to the practical experience turn out to be the best combination. At Hebrew school, a teacher told Roger Gould, "They can take our jewels and cars and furs and houses, but they can never rob us of our education." Gould himself said, "The capacity to learn is always present. The inherent opposition to learning is variable. Everyone has certain built-in defenses. Their rigidity and influence is central." Gould himself has no such defenses. He says, "When I read something, I absorb it, pulverize it, cut it up, use it here and there. So by the time I'm finished using it, it no longer exists in its original form." This is how learning is meant to be active, passionate, and personal. What you read should be grist for your own mill. You should make it yours. One last word from Francis Hesselbein. If there's anything I really believe in, it's the joy of learning and learning every day. The broadening experience. Travel is another kind of learning. All the cliches about it are true. It does broaden. It is revelatory. It changes your perspective immediately because it requires new and different responses from you. Things are done differently in other countries. People are more relaxed or less so, more reserved or more volatile. Their rituals vary. In Paris, many shops close down entirely in August. In Spain, an afternoon siesta follows a long lunch, and dinner is very late. Language is suddenly a barrier. The simplest transaction can turn complex all of a sudden. A friend of mine once went from London to Paris, and she was so preoccupied with re-gearing her brain to figure in francs rather than pounds that she said, "For 24 hours, I couldn't speak English or French. I went into a tobacco shop and asked for 14 packets of Kents. The shopkeeper looked at me as if I were quite mad. People buy 1 or 2 or even 10 packages of cigarettes, but they don't buy 14. I'd meant to say 4 packs, of course. The extent to which travel broadens depends at least partly on how much you give yourself to the experience. Those who immerse themselves in a different culture are likely to learn more than those who head for the Paris McDonald's. At the same time, there's a difference between immersing oneself in a new culture and going native. Sitting in les deux magots, wearing a beret, is not necessarily being a critical learner. If you lose perspective on yourself and your own roots, you have merely put on the garb of another culture. You need to keep the sense of difference. Henry Thoreau wrote that one sees the world more clearly if one looks at it from an angle. In a foreign land, one sees everything from an angle. Thorstein Veblen theorized that many Jews developed acute intelligence because they were perpetual exiles. The stranger in a strange land sees more and sees fresh. Being on the road not only requires the full deployment of oneself, it redeploys one, tests one's strengths and weaknesses, and exposes new strengths and weaknesses. Our two most sophisticated founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin, were inveterate travelers and both spent much time in Europe. Those who travel farther from home learn even more. Alfred Gottschalk learned the outsider's lesson at an early age. I came to America as a refugee. I had no identity or only a negative identity. I was Jewish, I was German, I dressed funny, I couldn't speak the language, and I was poor financially. But I graduated from Brooklyn Boys High with a 92 average, and I played football. I became independent very early. As leaders have traditionally been travelers, they've also traditionally had rich private lives. They've been Sunday painters, poets, even chefs, and they've always made time to reflect. Joseph Campbell, the world's foremost authority on mythology, told Bill Moyers in an interview shortly before his death, "You must have a room or a certain hour or so a day when you don't know what was in the newspapers that morning. You don't know who your friends are. You don't know what you owe anybody. You don't know what anybody owes to you. This is a place where you can simply experience and bring forth what you are and what you might be. This is the place of creative incubation. At first, you may find that nothing happens there, but if you have such a sacred place and use it, something eventually will happen. Whether one chooses a daily retreat or a formal sabbatical, one has access to one's soul, to one's imagination, and one can truly reflect on one's experience and learn from it and emerge renewed and refreshed." Friends and mentors. As much as we each need such regular respite, we need true engagement too. We need mentors and friends and groups of allied souls. I know of no leader in any era who hasn't had at least one mentor. Teachers who found things in them they didn't know were there. Parents or older siblings. Senior associates who showed them the way to be, or in some cases, not to be, or demanded more from them than they knew they had to give. When asked who had inspired him, Jamie Raskin said, "The people I've admired most are the people I know or know of historically who've been able to see seemingly unrelated things coming together." One of my favorite people was Martin Luther King. Something I read by him when I was a kid had such an effect on me. He said that all life was interrelated, all humanity part of one process, and to the degree that I harm my brother, to that extent I am harming myself. A lot of leadership is based on the ability to see how all humanity is related, how all parts of society are related, and how things move in the same direction. My father has this quality too. He's able to make those kinds of connections and see the humanity in everyone. My dad taught me how to think, and my mom taught me how to write. Aviator Brooke Knapp said, "I learned my sense of quality and performance from my grandmother, the matriarch of the family. It was she who demanded that I finish college." Former college president Alfred Gottschalk learned from many sources. "I learned how to cook and sew and clean from my mother, and I worked during the summers as a waiter in the Catskills. My father died when I was 16, so I was required to learn courage early. My mentors would include my father, my mother, my rabbi, and my football coach. The football team was made up of Irish and blacks and Italians and Poles, and they were my family. That's where, in a sense, I became an American, and where I learned that you must never quit." Roger Gould's mentors came from the university. He said, "I had 40 cousins, and I was the only one of us who went to college. They were affluent, but they put absolutely no premium on education. They valued wiles, street smarts, never education. So I faced a blank screen, no preconceptions, restrictions, or restraints. I was very inspired by the classics. They were my transition into another life, my own private underground, which I could appreciate by myself and never talk to anyone about." In my first semester in college, it was as if someone had opened a great big candy store of ideas, and it was all up for grabs. A professor of philosophy immediately became my intellectual father. I decided I wanted to be a philosopher, and therefore I had to know everything.
Former CAF CEO Robert Doxson found his principle: mentors and models entirely in books. My mentors were people I read about, such as Richard Byrd, the explorer, rather than people I knew. I was just terribly inspired by Byrd. I don't envy any man, and I haven't tried to emulate anyone except on the golf course. Friends offer inspiration and encouragement and more. Then AUW head and Bryant told me, friends are vital. You learn from them because they tell you the truth. Barbara Corday's writing partner was also her best friend. She said, Barbara Avedon and I had a great partnership. My daughter used to say that what we did for a living was laugh, because every time she called the office, we were laughing. For 8 or 9 years, we were not only collaborators and partners, we were best friends. We raised our children together and went on vacations together, and our families were very close. It happened coincidentally to be in the early days of the women's movement, and I think that was an interesting time to go through together. We each went through a divorce and a remarriage. With the other, we each went through the child rearing. With the other, we really had a very special time, and I loved it. Given this, it seems fitting that the Cordavidon relationship produced Cagney and Lacey, the long-running and highly acclaimed TV series about a pair of policewomen who were close friends as well as partners. The series was not only the first hit show to feature female buddies, but the first cop show to focus as much on the personal lives of its protagonists as on their work. During John Scully's tenure at Apple, he found both inspiration and friendship in his own field from Alan Kay, one of the polymath gurus of the computer age. Alan Kay is sort of my spiritual leader, Scully said. He doesn't look like a leader or dress like a leader, but if you believe in the power of ideas, he's a fountainhead, a wonderfully inventive person who's able to skip across an intellectual landscape comprising many disciplines. Computer Whiz K played a kind of Merlin to Scully's. Arthur, groups, gatherings of friends or associates, sometimes simply sustain and encourage their members, as with old school friends, army buddies, business pals, but sometimes they make history, as with FDR's Brain Trust, Eisenhower's General Staff, John Kennedy's Irish Mafia, the Bloomsbury writers, and the Bauhaus designers.
J. Robert Oppenheimer, Jr., directed what has been called the most exclusive club in the world at Los Alamos, New Mexico. In the early years of World War, the second Oppenheimer said of the scientists who gathered to develop the atomic bomb, it was a remarkable community inspired by a high sense of mission, of duty and of destiny, coherent, dedicated, remarkably unselfish, devoted to a common purpose. Former Johnson & Johnson CEO Jim Burke told me of a very different but equally remarkable group of friends, all of whom achieved extraordinary success in business. My 6 closest friends in the world all became close friends at Harvard Business School. I think I have more close friends than most people, and I made most of them there. A lot of it came out of the bonding of our values. We also were alike in wanting to work very hard, and we were all excited about the opportunities to do something with our lives. Our lives are all wound up with each other. There is, in fact, a value system that runs through us all, and we view the world in identical terms. On top of that, we have a hell lot of fun. learning from adversity. Study, travel, people, work, play, reflection, all are sources of knowledge and understanding, but so, curiously, are mistakes. John Cleese, who, in addition to his memorable comic turns in movies and with Monty Python, writes and produces equally memorable business training films, said, "It's self-evident that if we can't take the risk of saying or doing something wrong, our creativity goes right out the window. The essence of creativity is not the possession of some special talent, it is much more the ability to play." He continued, "In organizations where mistakes are not allowed, you get two types of counterproductive behavior. First, since mistakes are bad if they're committed by the people at the top, the feedback arising from those mistakes has to be ignored or selectively reinterpreted in order that those top people can pretend that no mistake has been made, so it doesn't get fixed. Second, if they're committed by people lower down in the organization, mistakes get concealed. The leaders I talked with are far from believing that mistakes are bad. They not only believe in the necessity of mistakes, they see them as virtually synonymous with growth and progress. Former Lucky Stores executive Don Ritchie said, "Even if you're pretty analytical by nature, you have to be willing to make a decision somewhere short of certainty. You just haven't got the time or the resources, even if it was possible to actually get that last finite piece of information that lets you deal with certainty. You have to get 80 or 85% of it and then take your best shot and go on to something else. That means you'll blow it now and then, but you also develop a momentum and a pace that gets to be exciting." Like Barbara Corday, leaders don't always see failures as mistakes. "My favorite project," she said, a TV series called American Dream, had a lot of things to say, was executed brilliantly, written and acted well, and produced beautifully. It was a critical success, but for whatever reason, the public chose not to watch it, and it lasted only 5 or 6 episodes. It was a flop. But I don't see it as a failure, so it also wasn't a mistake. Mistakes aren't failures either, and I don't take them seriously.